Welcome. Hi, this is Bill Curtis. I'm the Executive Director of the Consortium for IT Software Quality, and I want to welcome you to this morning's webinar on latest advances in cybersecurity and the new CISK security metric. The Consortium for IT Software Quality is a special interest group of the Object Management Group, which was chartered to create automatable measures that could be taken from the source code for software size and quality. We've recently announced the approval by OMG of 4 measures as standards, international standards for measuring software quality from the source code. And these measures are for security, reliability, performance efficiency, and maintainability. This morning's webinar is going to be about what appears to be the most popular measure, which is on security. And it's going to be presented by Bob Martin, who led the effort to develop that measure from the Common Weakness Enumeration. Bob is the director of the Common Weakness Enumeration project at MITRE, which is funded by the Department of Homeland Security, and is an industry repository for weaknesses that are known to be exploited by hackers to penetrate systems. This has been the basis for the work we've done on security and the Consortium for IT Software Quality. And Bob is going to tell you more about cybersecurity, latest advances in that, and latest advances in how to measure the security of a piece of software, especially as regards to the new CISK security metric. So Bob, let me turn it over to you, and at the end of the briefing I'll come back and we'll have time for questions, and I'll show you how to become a member of CISK. So Bob, let me turn it over to you and continue on with the webinar.
Thank you, Bill. And as you said, it's the latest advances. It's still a field that's improving, and there's a lot to improve upon. So with that, I'll get going here. So one of our biggest problems these days is that you can no longer just think about your systems. You're connected, whether it's a direct connection of data or it's an action that somebody else has to take before you can do your job. And so when we get to the question about security and safety and those type of issues, your assurance is not just about your implementation and things you can do. You have to worry about what the others you depend on do, whether they've got an unpatched vulnerability, they've developed an application that has a mistake in it that would let somebody attack it. And in general, the problem has gotten bigger, and so the idea of standards is important so that if somebody tells you what they're doing, you can actually understand it, and they're using terms and terminology and concepts you can actually gain assurance from hearing about. So some of those terms that I'm going to be using, and we've already started using them, is weaknesses, vulnerabilities, exploits, and exposures. So weaknesses are general things that can go wrong. We're going to talk about them from a software perspective. So things in design, code, architecture, or the deployment of that software that could, in fact, end up being exploitable. So in weaknesses, CWE, the Common Weakness Enumeration, characterizes some of those. There are some that we have not characterized yet, and that's part of the ongoing nature of things. Now, when an actual weakness manifests in a system in a way that's exploitable, then that's a vulnerability. CWEs, there's about 700 of them. We don't think that's going to grow hugely. But vulnerabilities happen in every product that has software. So there's a project called the Common Vulnerability and Exposures that's been around since 1999 that basically catalogs those for publicly known vulnerabilities. A 0-day is just a weakness that has been shown to be vulnerable, and nobody's known about it before then. So there are still unreported, undiscovered vulnerabilities in the software we have running. It's just latent defects ready to be triggered. The common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVEs, have about 72,000, and it's growing at about 120 a week. The other part of this is the attack, the exploit. And there is an effort called the Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification, or CAPEC, that actually catalogs those because they don't happen by magic. Attackers have to go through the same cyber infrastructure, the same networks and the same memory space and so on. And so that's what that effort is attempting to do. But basically, a weakness becomes a vulnerability when there is some way it can be exploited and that impact has some negative implication to the system or the business. So those are hopefully give you enough terminology to follow the rest of this presentation. So one of the things that the MITRE Corporation and our sponsors at DHS and SANS Institute and many other in the industry did 3 different times, and we'll probably do it again, is we looked at all the weaknesses of things that can go wrong and tried to understand which are most important. The first time we did it in 2009, we came up with a list, but it basically wasn't that sorted. There was a top one, but the rest were pretty much all also rans. The second time we ran it, we started using different items to prioritize. How bad is the impact, or how often does it happen? The third time we ran it, and this time the order changed some, we also brought into how easy was it to exploit that. Well, those 3 concepts actually became part of the Common Weakness Scoring System, and so all of this stuff has some linkage. The top 25 work was discussed. Microsoft blogged about it and how their secure development lifecycle addressed those issues. And you can see in the far left that some were resolved by education, some by a manual process, some by tools, and some by their threat modeling. So you get the idea that there's different approaches that can give you insight into avoiding different issues. They also wrote an article in IEEE Security and Privacy about how to work against these issues. So that material then was brought in as one of the things that the CISK community studied and looked at, but we actually wanted to make sure that these were measurable by tools. So some of those activities, like a manual review or looking at the running code, weren't possible. So of the top 25, we basically followed the ISO process to identify and organize the material, but it basically came down to 19 of the top 25 CWEs, which are the ones that are measurable. So coming out of the CISK work, we had a report, we had a document, and then that was brought into the object management group, and as Bill talked about, that was announced and passed as a new standard. And so let me quickly walk through that standard. There's a couple other things in it. This is just the table of contents, but you'll see there's something called IPMSS. Well, actually, it's now the structured pattern meta model. But basically, it's talking about how do you recognize the constructs that are problematic. So we make use of another OMG standard there. There's down at the bottom, you see structured metrics meta model. So there's an OMG standard on how to depict metrics, and we make use of that. And then we also make use of the knowledge discovery meta model, and all of this then is put as patterns. So this standard is really meant for tool vendors. You can read it, but it's better if your tool vendor implementer has actually read it and programmed it into their tool. You'll also notice that there's actually 22 CISK rules. That's because 2 of the CWEs have more than one pattern that they have to look for. So you'll also see in the standard a discussion of compliance. And so there's talk about, it's based on automated analysis, which I already mentioned. It has to be transparent and verifiable. And also I talked about the other standards that are made use of within this standard. And then the actual, you can see the actual material pretty much directly out of the CISK report, a discussion of what the issue is, the rules, and then the measure for them. So this is just showing you the different measures, and here is a depiction of what a CISK pattern is, and as you can see, it's pretty much unintelligible to humans, but given the patterns and the structure of it, it's very informative to tool vendors on how to find and report these issues. So what that does is it brings these areas into a standard. Now, CVE, CWSS, which is a way of scoring CVEs, CWE, I've already made reference to CWSS, and I'll talk more about it, as well as CAPEC are already international standards in the International Telecommunications Union, X15, 20, 21, 24, 25, and 44. And they're already made use of in ISO documents. So what this does is bring a way of measuring some of those into that same general international body level. So if we step back a moment, why are we doing this? Well, again, we're all connected, we're interconnected, we're dependent, and so we need to gain some assurance about what's going on in our systems and why we should have confidence that they're going to do what we intended them to do when we need them to do it. So one of the ways we think of that, and this is a diagram borrowed from the OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, although I've altered it a little bit. Basically, you're worried about threats on the left and what they can do operationally on the right. And as I said, they don't get there magically. They actually have attack patterns that they can practice that target specific weaknesses or the exploitable version of those weaknesses, which would be CVEs for publicly known issues. And the question is, can they actually get through to assets and functions in a way that can have a material impact? Now, that question gets a little more complicated because there's different impacts that they can actually cause. They can end up being able to modify data, read data, do unreliable execution, cause a resource consumption, execute unauthorized code, gain privileges, bypass protection mechanisms, or hide their activities. So the question is whether those kinds of impacts actually have a material operational impact. So it may be that not every vulnerability that you have actually could impact what you're doing in that application. So it adds a little nuance. But the big question is what countermeasures or actions you can take. And I'm not talking operational actions when the system is deployed. Countermeasures can be happening well in the early phases as you're thinking about your architecture, thinking about the design, thinking about how people are going to use the system, whether it's one privileged user or several people will be involved. What kind of security features will you have? What will be the actual landscape of security capabilities? But then you also have static analysis, dynamic analysis tools. You have looking at your attack surface, and so on. So there's a lot of different opportunities.
Bob, I'm
Yep.
sorry. It's Tracy from CISK. Can we just check one thing? Because I'm hearing from a couple people that they can't see the slides. Could you just click under screen sharing in the GoToWebinar toolbar, and if there's a button there for show my screen, I just want to make sure that it's on for you. I see your screen, but I'm getting some feedback. Do you see that button?
Okay. Yep, show. I thought it was. I'm sorry.
Oh, no. I'm not sure because I can see your screen. I just want to double check. Maybe there's a little. If you can hold on.
Able to see.
Were you able to see, Bill?
Yes, I could see it.
Okay. Well, I apologize for those. We can make the slides available as well, and hopefully the webinar will be online. So
Yep,
hopefully
they can see them.
that
Yep,
version.
we're good. We're good.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Yep. So hopefully my narrative has helped, and the pictures are just a interesting animation. Anyways, moving along. So the idea, though, is if an attacker can do several attacks, the question is, well, if there's several paths to that attack, several different attack patterns that they would make use of, is one of them or two of them actually going to be able to find a weakness that's in an exploitable position that actually gets through the countermeasures, has impact on a function, and it does it in a way that actually has operational impact. So this is a definite management, manageable activity. This is not a black and white situation where you have to eliminate all possibilities of attack or all possibilities of vulnerabilities. It basically is something that needs to be managed, and that's where the CISK metrics, where the attack patterns, the CWEs, the CVEs are all part of the tools to help you do that management. So one of the other issues you have to do is prioritize. And so the Common Weakness Scoring System, which was issued back in September 2014, it is now also available to help you figure out which weaknesses actually can have a business impact. We use things called a vignette and a technical impact scorecard. If you want to get to know more about those, please visit the website. CWE.MITRE.org has material on it. But also, this is an ITU standard as of March of this year. So basically, it takes the methodology that we used in coming up with the top 25 and makes it available for you to tailor, given what applications are doing for you and what those 8 technical impacts are. It may be different if you're in a business system versus a manufacturing system versus a control system in a plane. So the idea is impacts are not consistent, and so which weaknesses you need to focus on will be different applications in different organizations. So the bottom line of what I just talked about is you have this collection of weaknesses. You put together a vignette about your application and what it's doing for you and what kinds of failures are the most impactful. The CWSS scoring approach can then be used to rank and score all the different CWEs, and then you can pick your cutoff point, and that can be your most important weaknesses. And so you basically can come up with your own top 25, but that's for those who really understand what they're doing in applications and really understand what their applications are doing for their customers. So the idea here for source code analysis tools, which would take the code, do some analysis, and come up with some findings. And that's great, but how they sorted those findings may not actually reflect which failure modes are most important to you. So the idea here is you would work through a vignette, create a technical impact score card, and then that would let you resort the findings into something that reflected how important the different failure modes are. So if we step back, I talked several times about there are many different activities going on that could help you understand the risks your systems are going to pose to your operations. It's all the way up to the beginning as you conceive of the system, as you go through design, do the development, and actually have running code, all the way to when you have the system in place and you can use blue teams or pen test teams. So all of these different activities are possibilities, and this is not something new. If you look out, you'll find tables like this one where people have been talking about different types of technology. Well, it turns out that those technologies are usually tied to life cycle phases. So they gave visibility into different types of vulnerabilities. And so what we did is we actually have started in CWE itself. If you go look, you'll see a common consequences. And it'll talk about what kind of detection methods would find that kind of issue. And what that actually gave us the inspiration to do was actually put the two things together, the technical impacts and the detection methods, into a table. And so this is available out under the Software Assurance On-Ramp part of CWE's website. It's part of the left menus there. And basically, if you look at it closely, each row is one of those technical impacts that you're trying to avoid that may be more important or less important depending on the application. And then each of the columns is a different kind of detection activity you could do. Some are going to be things you can do early in the life cycle. Some you need to actually have a design. Some you need to have code. Some you need to have running code. And some you can do once you have a deployed system. But the idea is, as a manager, you could plan those activities ahead of time to make sure they're addressing the kinds of issues you're worried about. So the bottom line is that once you've identified the weaknesses you care about, the question is, what kinds of things do I put in place? So whether it's the code review, static analysis, they each have different coverage. And that's another important thing here, is that not every capability is going to find all weaknesses. In fact, none of them will claim that. And the question is how do those match? The things that you care about versus the tools and services and types of assessments, you want to make sure that they match up. So just happens that recently Gartner put out a new Magic Quadrant for this area, and you'll see there's many different tools, and most of them actually make use of CWE, and many of them are getting ready to use CWSS to sort their findings. But another part of that is they actually register their use of CWE. So we have a compatibility program. It's free. It's just meant to highlight tools that are making use of CWE, and therefore if you're interested in using CWE as a way of tracking what's going on, all these tools and offerings are things that you could make use of. But the other thing that CWE compatibility talks about is the question of coverage. Some work that the Center for Assured Software did back in 2006 and 2009, and they continued to do it. They had a whole bunch of test cases, and they ran 6 different tools over those test cases, and they have always found that large percentages of the tests aren't covered by any tool, and each tool only covers a not small, but a portion. So the idea is you need a toolkit to actually cover your issues. And part of that is that we have the vendors actually claim and make a public document available about what they cover. So if you understand which weaknesses you care about, you can match that against the coverage claims of the different vendors and make sure that you're getting a tool that actually claims to be looking for the things you care about. Now, again, some things won't be found by tools, but when they are, this is a good approach. And then the CISK Top 25 is another slice through this. Rather than looking for individual weaknesses, now you can look for a whole grouping of them and which vendors are claiming that they cover those. So all this gets down to a question about assurance. Software assurance is an issue across the government, industry. It's a research topic. It's a real issue for many of us if you think about how much of your life is based on software. And so the assurance really comes down to how repeatable and how defendable your assurance is to someone else. So the idea of an assurance case is the other concept I wanted to get across to everyone. It's basically, you know, you're gaining confidence, but you're doing it based on evidence, and an assurance case gives you a way of tying those together. So basically, an assurance case usually can be consisted of the claim that you're gaining assurance about, the evidence that supports that, and then some type of argument that says that evidence shows that the claim or a subclaim is actually met. Now, some other approaches give a different words. There's a goal instead of a claim, but the idea is that it's basically you break your claim or your what you're gaining assurance about into subclaims, and you argue you have evidence to support that the claim is legitimate. So this all comes from some work done in the late 50s, early 60s by Stephen Coleman. And there are tools out there from Adelard and University of York, and several from other groups like NASA and Japanese researchers have a couple. But basically, what they've all been trying to work towards is a way of graphically depicting, you know, what is it you're trying to gain confidence about, how do you break that down, and you have to defend that the things you've broken it into, the subclaims, actually are equivalent to that top claim, and also that the context of that claim, it's not just a open-ended claim, it's, you know, within certain bounds. But eventually you want to be able to show that evidence actually supports that you've met those claims or not. So the in fact, in the medical world, you're seeing a whole bunch of requirements for assurance cases. FDA, if you're going to offer an infusion pump, now you need to make your arguments about its safety as an assurance case as of January of this year. So there's an interest in doing this in a more repeatable way, and it's not just for the medical industry, it's also for aeronautics, it's for manufacturing plants, so there's a lot of different areas. And so ISO has weighed in on this a couple of years ago, and there's a ISO standard on systems and software assurance. Part 2 is about the assurance case, and it basically has the same construct, of course, like many standards. It has a couple of extra additions to its logic, but it basically is the same structure. In the object management group, the Systems Assurance Task Force has been looking at this as the ability to knit together the assurance cases from different tools, from different vendors, because everything we build today is a composition of different efforts from different groups. And so the idea of assurance case standard in the object management group is a standard that would allow assurance cases to be exchanged and integrated. In fact, we've come up with a couple different requirements or things we think that assurance case tooling would help us with is that, you know, if you weren't in the room when the assurance argument was made, will you understand it? So we think model-based assurance cases would let you, you know, as a third party, gain assurance quicker and in a much more repeatable way. It would improve the rigor of assurance cases. It would let you re-examine the assumptions, re-examine the argument, the way you've argued your evidence. You could re-examine the appropriateness of evidence. For instance, you know, about 10, 12 years ago, if you had a buffer overflow issue, all that really meant is an attacker could end up making your system crash. And so how much rigor you put in and how you argued that you've done enough and you had, you know, the ability to restart your system and so on may have been appropriate. But then it became possible to actually not only use a buffer overflow to make your system crash, but you could actually get running code and basically take over the system. So now the appropriateness of your past actions may not be right, and you may want to relook at that. Doesn't mean your whole assurance case needs to be thrown out. It just means that some of your assumptions and some of the types of evidence you found appropriate would have to be re-examined. We also think that there's going to be a reuse, basically, you know, arguments and evidence pairs that people have found convincing that you want to see over again, and you want to know it's being reused so that you know it's shown to be useful in the past. Also, the idea of analytics against assurance cases, maybe a whole marketplace there. And then, of course, the import and export. And more importantly, I think, is the idea of communities of interest to have norms of practice and norms of vocabularies. So assurance cases, while the model may be the same, your actual word you use in the assurance case will be very different if you're an aeronautics, you know, participant versus somebody in the medical, versus somebody in industrial control systems, versus somebody in power line safety. So the idea is that we would have libraries of terminology that could be specified by these communities and then enforced and then use in assurance cases. So my last slide, and I hope we have a lot of questions, is this is the current model that of assurance case meta model, called the structured assurance case meta model. And the key parts here, I know you can't read it, but it'll be publicly available later in next month. The top is basically utility type of elements. The middle orange is the assurance case structure itself. The green is the argumentation model. The kind of chartreuse in the bottom left is the evidence model, and the blue is the terminology package. It's a fairly simple model, and we've already got several vendors involved in adopting it. So hopefully, you know, this will become a tool that will help people gain assurance and actually do it in a more disciplined and measurable and repeatable way. So with that, I hope to take some more of your time with questions.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay, Bob, thanks. Tracy, do you want to handle the questions then?
Yeah, sure. I just put out a call for questions as well through the chat box, and I'm just looking to see. And I just want to let everyone know that we are recording the webinar today, and we'll post it on the CISK YouTube channel. So this afternoon I'll send an email out with a link to YouTube and also with a copy of the presentation file. But if you have any questions, you can submit them. But we don't have any just yet. So if there was anything else, Bill and Bob, that you wanted to mention. Oh, you know what? Here's one. Bob, can you give examples of an evidence model?
Okay, so the evidence model probably is not going to be a useful construct totally of itself. The idea is that you are going to make some claim about something, and you may have gathered a bunch of evidence about the system and its pieces and how it was built. And so you've built an evidence model to support that assurance case. The idea is that you don't have to have a new evidence model for every assurance case. They could be reused. And so the idea would be that as you build your systems, you basically gain measurement information and store it as a model, and to support several different assurance cases you may need to make. Because you may need to argue that your system is safe, that it's secure, that it's reliable, that it meets the contract. And the idea is you don't want to have different repositories for each of those. In fact, in the open group, they've got an effort that basically describes how an engineering effort would dependably build a system that met several quality objectives. And they make use of the object management group's SACM as the kind of knowledge base, but they do go iteratively through each design choice and our alternative and say, okay, have I met my objectives to be dependably reliable, or to only use this amount of energy, or to weigh this much? So the idea is that you know, an evidence model would basically be supporting, you know, many different kinds of assurance cases against the same product, because the product is the product. It, you know, it has internal integrity, and so the evidence model would want to support that. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thanks. And the next question here, we did get a whole handful in, so here we go. Can you please discuss the implications for achieving workable norms of the breadth of SDO activity that's out there?
Well, okay. Not quite sure how to interpret that, but you know, there are many SDOs working in adjacent areas where assurance and measurement of security, safety, other quality issues are cropping up. So personally, I think what's going on is this whole area is one where, well, let me take an aside. So in the world of safety of structures, you know, we've had thousands and thousands of years of, you know, practice about what makes a structure safe. And today we have building codes with inspectors. We have people who, you know, check the soil before anyone disturbs it. They do drilling. They look at the footings, they look at what go into the footings, they look at the steel, they look at the material content of the steel, they look at lots of things. Well, they didn't know to look for all those things originally. And it took a long time, a lot of disasters and a lot of investigation to figure out what is it that you need to measure in order to get a safe and stable and reliable building trade and building activities. Similar evolution, very compressed, is happening in software. When people started writing their first programs, 50, 60, 80 years ago, no one knew, what would make software unstable or let somebody do something that you hadn't intended. And now it's everywhere, but we still don't have that knowledge. So getting that practice is really the challenge that a lot of people are trying to address. And part of that is, well, what is it that makes software fail? And so the weaknesses in CWE, there are other quality issues that need to be enumerated as well. But basically, those are the things we want to measure, and whether or not they're critical to your application depends on the failure modes of those quality issues, and then whether or not you have confidence that they're there depends on how good the assessment techniques, tools, processes are. And so many different standards groups are focused on measurement or transmission of data about what was measured. There's standards groups that are about the process and the activities, and there are standards groups that focus on different technology areas. So getting these, kind of consistent and evolving practices into all of those is a hard job, and anyone who would like to help in that is welcome to, because it is a big challenge.
Thank you. Bob, what is being done to disseminate these ideas at the decision maker or executive level, and what do you consider in your experience to be some best practices when making these concepts as widely known as possible?
Well, one of the big, that's a huge challenge area. We're finally having the ability to talk to technical people about these issues, and I think now that we can relate the technical measurement to technical failures and then bridge the gap to operational impact, that story about, well, what's the business impact of this? It was a missing piece, and so that's one of the newer areas. There is work in bringing this into kind of the norm of practice of building software. One of the groups I'm involved in is the Systems and Software Assurance forums and working groups, which meet quarterly in the Washington area. It's a combined sponsorship of DHS, DOD, NIST, and GSA. And we basically have a 3-day meeting where we will have working groups on tough issues, but also have presentations on different concepts. And it covers education, it covers policy, it covers tools and technology, trying to bring some balance across those different areas. There's also interested in, well, they've established certification for education in computer security, software security. They've influenced the national cybersecurity framework and NICE about job categories to make sure these areas about the security and safety of software are addressed. every once in a while we have a congressional staffer or somebody from the White House there or presenting. So it's a long-term engagement, and anyone who has ideas or opportunities, it's a long-term issue.
Thank you. The next question. We spent a bunch of money on an enterprise static code analyzer. If we ask for additional software assurance measures, decision makers are likely to push back, saying that static code analysis should be enough. Your methodology promises to point out gaps in our coverage and support the acquisition of tools and techniques to address these gaps. Is this true, or is this wishful thinking?
No, that's exactly what this is going to show you. Is, you basically want to think about what are your applications, what are they doing, what are the failure modes of those 8 that would really ruin the day of the operations if those failures had manifested, and then what types of techniques and tools and methodologies could find those things, and then match it against what you have in practice. That's something that big companies like EMC, Microsoft, Adobe, Apple, Oracle, they're using these concepts of CWE and CVE and so on to measure what they're doing against the things they're trying to remove. And it's not going to be an easy sell, but if you can get the specifics about what failures you're not looking for given your current tools, that's going to be a win-win, I think. Now the 2 questions are, which kinds of methods are effective at finding which kinds of weaknesses. DoD has been investing in that question. IDA, the Institute for Defense Analysis, did a study 2 years ago, that concluded about a year ago, looking across everything that they could and doing basically a state-of-the-art report on which kinds of methodologies find or can give insight into which kinds of weaknesses. And that's available up on the DoD Systems Engineering website. I think our CWE website also refers to it. But also the Center for Assured Software, with those test cases that they were running, I showed the pie charts of the coverage. They're continuing to do that, and so they're continuing to try to get a handle on which tools and techniques are actually effective. So you're not just, what does the tool vendor or the pen test team tell you they're doing. You want to be able to actually know that that's the kind of thing that they're good at finding. And so that actually gets me back to something I meant to talk about, is the attack patterns in CAPEC can also be thought of as a way of asking your blue team or pen test team or the pen test group that you hire, what are they actually attempting? What attack patterns are they using? I have a worry that some pen test teams have 1 or 2 weapons in their arsenal, and they know how to use them, but that may only be 2% of the attacks you could face. And so getting some insight into what coverage they're offering versus what landscape there is to cover is another part of managing this area.
Thank you. A question from Brian Murphy from Silver Thread. It's a 2-part question. When we consider impacts, what is the best way to quantify those impacts? And secondly, what, and maybe Dr. Curtis will have some thoughts on this part too, what work is being done to tie technical debt into this conversation?
Okay, so the technical impacts, you know, if we go back, I think basically there was 8 of them. Oops, didn't quite get there. There. So, you know, basically what you want to do is the idea, and I mentioned it, but I didn't say much about it, is you want your application to be as small as possible. So you may need to use subsystems or modules. But the idea is you write a little vignette about what that piece of software is doing and what the critical functions are. And then against that vignette, you look and you compare, you know, on a scale of 0 to 10, how bad would these different technical impacts be? And this is laid out in the Common Weakness Risk Analysis Framework and Common Weakness Scoring System discussion. And so the idea is that weaknesses that let somebody read data, you may not care about that too much. But if they could change the data, that could be, you know, game over. That application, you know, it's a flight controller for the wing of an aircraft. You can't allow that kind of problem. You won't get approval from the FAA to fly that. So, you know, the idea is it's in the context of the application and what are the critical functions of that application and what of these failure modes is the thing you need to avoid the most. And, you know, obviously, you know, a 0 says, I don't care about it at all. A 10 says this is the most significant. And then you can, you know, provide some spread of your concern across the others. So, Bill, you want to talk about technical debt?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. CISK is moving on with a new set of measures that we're going to develop and offer to OMG as potential standards. One of which involves a definition or an estimate of the overall technical debt in an application, but it's going to primarily measure the structural problems that we know have to be fixed. So when you take the CISK metrics that have just been accepted by OMG as standards for measuring the security, the reliability, the performance efficiency, and the maintainability of a piece of software, we can look at those violations, because each of those measures is composed of a number of violations, as Bob just described for the security metric. And we can look at those violations, all of which had the property of they're things we believe you must fix. We didn't include violations that you could defer indefinitely. We really just picked the ones that the members of CISK felt were critical and had to be removed from the code. And therefore, those involve effort you're going to have to spend in the future, which provides us a guide to how we estimate how much technical debt is in an application. If it's something you know you have to fix, then you're going to spend effort in the future, and therefore that represents technical debt. If we define technical debt as effort you'll have to spend to fix known problems in the software. So that lets us then begin building a technical debt measure based on the existing CISK measure. So we could have an overall measure, or we could have a measure of the technical debt in each of these quality areas. By estimating the amount of effort required to fix a particular violation and looking at the number of times that violation appears in a piece of code and summing that up across all the violations in a particular CISK metric or all of the CISK metrics, we get an estimate of the overall effort you're going to have to spend, at least on the violations that we know you have to fix. You may want to fix more than that, you may want to fix less than that, but at least we have a good way to estimate the technical debt, which then would correlate with the overall cost of ownership of a particular application. So we're working on that measure. We expect we will submit it to OMG either in March or in June of next year, and hopefully by the end of next year we may have it approved as a standard that's available for vendors to implement in their static analysis technology if they've already implemented the 4 CISK measures that were approved this year. So that's one way to estimate technical debt. It's one way to tie technical debt to these quality areas and give us a reasonably standard definition. There's more things you might include in technical debt, a number of definitions out there, but we will at least have a definition with an attached measure for how you would measure the technical debt related to structural problems in the code, these sort of non-functional violations that just represent bad engineering, bad software engineering in reliability or security or any of the other areas. So that's one way we're going to tie technical debt to the CISK measures that were just approved as standard by OMG. Tracy, next question.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And with these measures that just became OMG standards, do you know of any tool vendors that are implementing the CISK-defined violations?
There are 2 that I know of that are publicly saying they're going to do it. One is Infrastroy. I think it has a different name when it markets in the U.S. and perhaps in Europe. They're a small, they're a technology vendor in the Ukraine, and they're very seriously engaged in implementing the CISK measures in their technology. And CAS Software, which is headquartered in Paris and New York, is also implementing the measures in their software. There may be others, but those are the 2 that I know have publicly announced that they will support the CISK measures within the next year.
Okay, thanks. And I think maybe we have time for one more question. This one is for Bob. Is there any work being done at MITRE and OMG with regards to advancing the security on the human side of the problem, perhaps the exploitability of the humanity of people?
Actually, so I struck out a couple of slides. In hindsight, I probably should have left them in. But so if you think about the diagram I had about the attackers and then the operational impact. Well, operations aren't, as you just implied with this question, only dependent on the software. The the hardware that's running, the communications links, the supply chain of all of those systems, and the people operating and building the system are all part of what helps bring the mission or the business function to fruition. So if the weaknesses and the attack patterns don't need to only talk about weaknesses and attacks against software. In fact, in the common attack pattern enumeration, they do have attack patterns against supply chain, against physical systems, against communications, and against people. Many social engineering type attacks are listed in the CAPEC. That is not true in CWE. Right now, CWE is only about software architecture, design, code, or deployment issues. But we do have a proposal that's looking for funding to basically include into CWE to build it out to non-software critical capabilities that help deliver mission or business capabilities. And so the methodology we've proposed is that we would look at attack patterns, identify attacks against capabilities, and then identify what weakness it is in that capability that the attack is exploiting to have the business impact or mission impact. So we're not going to just, say, okay, people are a weak issue. What are all the weaknesses? We're going to instead say, okay, what attacks can you articulate that we can actually describe that can reasonably be implied to have a business impact? and then what is the weakness that is actually being exploited, and what's the impact, what are the mitigations, how can you detect it, and so on. So not there yet, but that's where we're hoping to move with some work.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bill, and thanks for everybody that joined us today. I think that's it for today.
Let me add that membership in CISK is free since we have sponsors that sponsor our work and our efforts. And I encourage you to go to www.it-cisq.org and join CISK, and there you'll be able to get copies of the standards, of white papers that describe how to use these various standards as SLAs and contracts, and other kinds of information about structural quality. So let me encourage you again to go to www.it-cisq.org and become a member and join the community that's very concerned about the structural quality of software. So thank you for attending today's webinar.
Thanks.